6 months ago, a patch of ocean in the middle of the Pacific was running cold. Tonight it has reversed so hard and so fast that scientists are reaching for a single word to describe what is forming out there. Godzilla. The index that decides whether we are in an El Niño has climbed from minus 0.55 to plus 0.48 in half a year, sitting 1/100th of a degree below the official line, and the models are hinting at something the planet has not seen in the entire instrumental record. The last time this machine reached its full strength, it helped kill tens of millions of people. So what exactly comes next when the strongest El Niño ever measured begins in real time, right in front of us? If that question pulls at you the way it pulls at me, do me a favour and tap that like button and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this is a story we're going to follow all the way to its peak. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether this strange year of weather has reached you yet. You're going to want to see how this one unfolds. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The signal forming in the bathtub. There is a stretch of ocean along the equator in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from the nearest city, that almost no one will ever see in person. It has no coastline, no skyline, no landmark. And yet the temperature of the water in that one remote band may end up shaping the next 3 years of your life more than almost anything happening where you actually live. Right now, in that water, something is changing. The numbers coming back from the buoys and the satellites are climbing, season after season, in the same direction, and a handful of scientists have started reaching for a word they do not use lightly. They are calling it a Godzilla. I want to be careful and honest with you from the very first sentence, because this is a story that gets exaggerated constantly, and I am not interested in selling you a disaster movie. So here is exactly where the data sits today. The official index that NOAA uses to measure this phenomenon, the one that decides whether we are in an El Niño or not, currently reads plus 0.48. The technical threshold to declare El Niño conditions is plus 0.5. So as I record this, we are not even officially there yet. We are sitting 1/100th of a degree below the line. By the strict definition, the status is still neutral. Now you might be thinking, then why are we here? Why does any of this matter if it has not even started? And that is the right question to ask, so let me answer it directly. It is not the single number that matters. It is the direction, the speed, and the company that number is keeping. Because just over half a year ago, that same index read minus 0.55. The Pacific was cool. We were on the cold side of the cycle, in the phase called La Niña. And then, season by season, the water reversed. Minus 0.55 became minus 0.37, then minus 0.14, then plus 0.13, and now plus 0.48. The surface temperature in that key region climbed from about 26 degrees Celsius to just over 28 degrees Celsius in the same window. Every single step pointed the same way. The ocean did not wobble, it turned hard, and it kept turning. That speed is the first thing that should get your attention, and I will tell you why it unsettles the people who study this for a living. A slow, gentle slide into El Niño gives the planet time. It gives farmers time to choose different seed, gives fisheries time to adjust, gives water managers time to plan. A fast flip does not. A fast flip means the ocean is loading energy quicker than the systems that depend on it can adapt, and the strongest, most violent El Niño events in the historical record tend to be the ones that loaded fast, the way this one is loading right now. The second thing is what the forecast models are saying about where this goes next. The European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, which runs one of the most respected prediction systems on Earth, along with the other major models, is projecting that the Central Pacific keeps warming through the back half of this year, and some of those model members are not projecting a modest little bump. They are pushing the temperature anomaly toward 3, even 4 degrees Celsius above normal. If a number anywhere near that actually verifies, then we are not talking about an ordinary El Niño at all. We're talking about an event that could rank among the strongest ever measured, in the same brutal weight class as the monsters of 1997 and 2015. The probability estimates for El Niño forming in the coming months sit somewhere around 80 to 90%. The ocean is not asking permission anymore. It is most likely coming. So let me define the word that keeps coming up, because it actually means something specific. When scientists casually say Godzilla or Super El Niño, they are pointing at the very top of the scale. An ordinary El Niño might push that index to plus 0.6 or plus 0.8. A strong one reaches plus 1.5. But a very strong event, the kind that earns the nickname, climbs to plus 2.0 or higher. For comparison, the legendary 1997 event peaked near plus 2.4. The 2015 event, the one a NASA climatologist actually first labelled Godzilla on the record, peaked near plus 2.6. That is the territory the high-end forecasts for this year are flirting with, and the reason that matters is not bragging rights. It is that the difference between an ordinary El Niño and a super El Niño is not just a matter of degree. It is the difference between nudging the planet's weather and reorganising it. This is the thread I want you to hold on to through this entire video because everything else hangs from it. The strongest El Niño in recorded history may be beginning right now, in real time, in that patch of water nobody sees. And the question that should keep you watching is not really whether it is coming. The question is what comes next when it does. Because we are not flying blind here. This has happened before. The historical record is full of these events, and the strongest ones left receipts. They left famines, dead reefs, broken harvests, and record-shattering heat. So the way to understand what a Godzilla El Niño does to the future is to look very carefully at what it did to the past. And some of that past is far darker than most people have any idea. I covered the moment this signal officially crossed into advisory territory in our video from a few days ago. The one about the Pacific smashing heat records faster than the models predicted. That video was about the beginning, the onset, the alarm going off. This one is different. This one is about consequences. We are going to walk forward from this signal and ask, honestly and with the data in hand, what the next 3 years could actually look like if this thing climbs into the range it is threatening to reach. But before we can read the future, we have to understand the machine. Because to most people, this is the part that sounds impossible. How does one patch of warm water in one ocean end up dictating whether it rains in Peru, burns in Australia, floods in California, or starves a harvest half a world away? How does a temperature change you could barely feel with your hand rearrange the weather of entire continents at once? The answer is one of the most elegant and, frankly, one of the most frightening pieces of machinery on the planet, and it is hiding right under the surface. Part 2. The machine beneath the surface. To understand why a warm patch of ocean can hijack the weather of half the world, you have to start with the wind. And not just any wind, but a set of winds so steady and so reliable that sailors built entire empires of trade around them, which is exactly why we still call them the trade winds. Along the equator, under normal conditions, the wind blows persistently from east to west, from the coast of South America out toward Indonesia and Australia. It blows that direction day after day, year after year, and as it does, it drags the warm surface water of the Pacific along with it. Picture the entire tropical Pacific as an enormous bathtub because that analogy is going to do a lot of work for us. The trade winds are like a constant breath blowing across the surface of that bathtub, always pushing the warm top layer of water toward the western side, toward Asia. Over time, that warm water genuinely piles up over there. The sea level near Indonesia normally sits measurably higher than the sea level near South America, and the warm layer over in the west is far thicker. That western pool of warm water is one of the most important features on the planet. It is the warmest large body of open ocean anywhere, and the air above it is constantly rising, building towering thunderstorms, dumping rain across Indonesia and the western Pacific. That rising air is the engine of a giant atmospheric loop. Now here is the other half of the trick. When the trade winds drag all that warm surface water westward, something has to replace it on the eastern side near South America. And what rises up to fill the gap is cold water from far below the surface. This process is called upwelling, and it is a gift. That cold water is loaded with nutrients, and when it surfaces along the coast of Peru and Ecuador, it turns that stretch of ocean into one of the most productive fisheries on the entire planet. The anchovies arrive in numbers that are hard to comprehend. Whole national economies have been built on that cold, nutrient-loaded, upwelling water. So under normal conditions, what you have is a beautifully balanced seesaw. Warm and rainy in the west, cool and fish-filled in the east, held in place by the steady push of the wind. Scientists call this the neutral phase, and as I mentioned, by the strict definition, that is technically still where we are sitting today. But the seesaw does not always stay balanced. Sometimes it tips, and there are two ways it can tip. When the trade winds blow even harder than usual, you get the cold phase, La Niña, where the eastern Pacific turns even cooler. And when the trade winds weaken, or stall, or in extreme cases actually reverse and start blowing the wrong way, you get the warm phase, you get El Niño, and this is the moment where the whole machine starts to turn against itself. When the trade winds slacken, that giant pile of warm water that had been held up against Asia is suddenly released. There is nothing pinning it in the west anymore, so it begins to slosh back eastward across the Pacific, like the water in a tub when you stop pushing it, and it surges back toward you. As that warm water spreads east, it does two devastating things at once. First, it shuts down the upwelling. The cold, nutrient-loaded water along South America can no longer break through to the surface, because now there is a thick blanket of warm water sitting on top of it. The fish vanish. The fishery collapses. In fact, that is how this whole phenomenon got its name. Peruvian fishermen noticed centuries ago that this warm water tended to arrive around Christmas, and they named it El Niño, the boy, after the Christ child. They named it long before any scientist understood the global machine behind it, because they were the first ones to feel it take their livelihood away. The second thing that warm water does is even bigger, because it picks up the atmospheric engine and moves it. Remember that giant zone of rising air and thunderstorms that normally sits over the western Pacific? Warm water is what fuels it. So when the warm water slides east, the rising air, the storms, the entire centre of atmospheric action slides east with it, out into the central and eastern Pacific where it has no business being, and once that engine relocates, the planet's great rivers of high-altitude wind, the jet streams, get bent into new positions. The storm tracks shift, the rain belts that decide who gets water and who does not get dragged thousands of miles from where they belong. That is the secret. That is how a patch of warm water rewrites the weather of continents. It does not reach out and touch Australia or California directly. It moves the atmosphere's engine, and the atmosphere does the rest. And there is one more piece, the piece that turns a small disturbance into a monster, and it has a name worth remembering. It is called the Preparedness feedback, after the scientist who first described it. Here is how it works, and here is why it is genuinely a little terrifying. When the trade winds weaken slightly, the eastern Pacific warms slightly. But that warming itself weakens the winds even further, because the winds are partly driven by the temperature difference across the ocean, and you have just reduced that difference. Weaker winds then allow even more warming. More warming weakens the winds even more. It is a loop that feeds itself, a runaway cycle where the cause amplifies the effect, and the effect amplifies the cause. That is why El Niño does not just gently appear. It can erupt, building on itself, month after month, until the warm water finally exhausts its supply, and the whole system collapses back and resets. That feedback loop, that self-feeding spiral, is exactly what the data suggests is spinning up in the Pacific right now. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it reframes the number we started with. When I told you the index swung from minus 0.55 to plus 0.48 in 6 months, that was not just a thermometer drifting upward. That was the Preparedness feedback engaging. That was the loop catching. And once that loop catches and the warm water is loading fast, the strongest events in history tell us what tends to happen on the other side. So now that you understand the machine, we can finally do the thing this video promised. We can look at what this machine has done before, when it spun all the way up into the monster range. And the first stop on that tour is not a gentle one. It is the single deadliest weather-related catastrophe in human history, an event that killed tens of millions of people, and almost nobody alive today has ever heard its name. I skipped over one piece of the machine that the strongest events depend on, and it is worth a moment because it explains why some El Niños erupt into monsters, while others stay modest. The secret is not just at the surface. It is in a hidden boundary, far down in the ocean, that scientists call the thermocline. The thermocline is the dividing line between the warm, sunlit surface water and the cold, dark water below, and its depth is not fixed. Under normal conditions, with the trade winds piling warm water in the west, the thermocline is pushed far down on the western side and sits shallow on the eastern side, close to the surface near South America, which is what allows that cold upwelling to break through so easily. But in the months before a big El Niño, something happens beneath the surface that you cannot see from a boat or even a satellite looking only at the skin of the ocean. A huge pulse of warm water, a kind of slow underwater wave, can travel eastward along the thermocline, carrying an enormous reservoir of heat hidden below the surface. When that subsurface heat finally reaches the eastern Pacific and rises, It can supercharge the event because the warmth was loaded and waiting all along. This is part of why forecasters watch not just the surface temperature, but the heat hidden far below it. Sometimes the clearest sign that a monster is coming is not on the surface at all. It is a bulge of warmth moving through the dark, weeks ahead of the storm it will become. Part 3. The year 50 million died. In the late 1870s, one of the strongest El Niño events in the entire historical record locked itself over the planet, and what followed was, by the numbers, the deadliest weather-related disaster in human history. Most people have never heard of it. There is no famous date for it, no anniversary, no monument that the average person could name. But somewhere between 30 and 60 million people died, and the figure most often cited is over 50 million. To put that in perspective, that is more deaths than the entire First World War. It happened because a patch of warm water in the Pacific shut off the rain across 3 continents at the same time. The event is sometimes called the Great Famine, or more precisely the global famines of 1876 through 1878. And the way it killed was through the exact machinery we just walked through. When that El Niño spun up, the rising air engine slid east into the Pacific, and the regions that depended on the normal pattern of rainfall were suddenly cut off. In India, the summer monsoon, the single most important weather event in the lives of hundreds of millions of people, simply failed. The rains that the entire agricultural calendar of the subcontinent was built around did not come. Crops withered in the fields. In northern China, the same shifted pattern brought a drought so severe that it is still remembered as one of the worst in the country's long-recorded history, centred on the provinces of the north where tens of millions depended on a harvest that never arrived. And across the ocean in Brazil, in the dry northeastern region called the Sertão, the rains failed there too, and a drought settled in that emptied entire villages. Think about what that means for a moment. 3 regions on 3 different continents separated by entire oceans all plunged into catastrophic drought in the same window of time. To anyone living through it, these looked like 3 separate tragedies, 3 unrelated acts of God. Nobody on the ground in India had any way of knowing that the same force starving them was starving farmers in China and Brazil. The connection was invisible, because the connection was a temperature anomaly in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that no one at the time could measure or even conceive of. This is the signature of a super El Niño written in its most extreme form. It does not cause one disaster. It causes many simultaneously in places that seem to have nothing to do with each other. Now I have to be honest with you about something because intellectual honesty is the whole point of this channel, and the real story here is more complicated and in some ways darker than just bad weather. El Niño created the drought. But El Niño did not by itself kill 50 million people. Human decisions did that. This was the height of the colonial era, and in many of the worst-hit regions, grain was still being exported for profit, even as local populations starved. Relief was withheld, delayed, or tangled in ideology. Railways that could have moved food were used to move it away from the hungry rather than toward them. The historian Mike Davis wrote a now famous book about exactly this, titled Late Victorian Holocausts, and his central argument is brutal and important. The argument is that these were not simply natural disasters. They were natural disasters that landed on top of human systems that turned a crisis into a mass death. The climate loaded the gun. Policy pulled the trigger. I am telling you this for a reason that matters enormously for the rest of this video, so do not lose it. The lesson of 1877 is not that a strong El Niño automatically kills tens of millions of people. We are not living in the 1870s. We have global food markets, satellite forecasting, emergency relief systems, and we can see this thing coming months in advance, which the Victorians could not. The lesson is the opposite, and it is sharper. The lesson is that the damage a super El Niño does is not set by the ocean alone. It is set by how prepared, how equipped, and how fair the human systems are when the drought hits. The ocean decides whether rain fails. We decide whether a failed harvest becomes a hard year or a humanitarian catastrophe. And that is a genuinely hopeful idea buried inside a horrifying one, because it means the worst outcomes are not fated. They are chosen. But here is the part that keeps the scientists up at night. The 1877 event was, for a long time, considered a freak, a once-in-many-generations extreme that we would likely never see the equal of again. And then the modern record started filling in, and the events kept coming, and they kept getting documented in detail that the Victorians never had. We started measuring exactly what a super El Niño does to a modern, connected industrial planet. And what we found in 1982, in 1997, in 2015, and again just a couple of years ago, is that even with all our technology and all our warning, these events still reach out and break things at a planetary scale. They just break different things now. The famines became smaller and the records became larger. So let me take you through the modern monsters, the ones we watched happen with satellites overhead, because they are the closest map we have to what the next 3 years could hold. There is one more thing about the 1877 catastrophe that I cannot leave out, because it is the detail that makes it impossible to dismiss as ancient history. The drought did not just kill through simple starvation. It killed through everything that follows when a society's food runs out. Disease swept through populations weakened by hunger. People abandoned their land and walked, by the millions, searching for food that did not exist, and many died on the roads. Social order frayed. The famine did not end cleanly either, because a population that has been starved does not recover the moment the rains return. The effects rippled forward for years, in broken health, lost livelihoods, and communities that never fully came back. This is the shape of what a super El Niño does at the absolute extreme, when it lands on a vulnerable society with no warning and no help. It does not produce one clean disaster. It produces a cascade, where the drought is only the first domino, and each domino knocks over the next long after the rain has returned. And the truly sobering part is that, by the measures we can reconstruct, 1877 was not some impossibly rare freak that the universe will never repeat. It was simply the strongest version of the exact same machine that is loading in the Pacific right now. The difference between that catastrophe and a survivable modern event is not the strength of the ocean signal. It is everything humanity has built in between. The warning systems, the food networks, the relief organizations. Strip those away, and the same ocean would do the same thing again. That is why the historians who study these events describe them not as natural disasters, but as a collision between a natural force and human vulnerability. The force is back. The only question that has ever mattered is how vulnerable we choose to be when it arrives. Part 4. The Modern Monsters. The modern era of watching El Niño really begins with a gut punch. In 1982 and 1883, when one of the strongest events of the century arrived and almost completely fooled the scientists who were supposed to be tracking it. This is worth knowing because it is a humbling story. At the time, the monitoring network was thinner, and a major volcanic eruption had thrown dust into the instruments and confused the satellite readings. So this enormous El Niño built up largely undetected until it was already in full force, and when it hit hard. Australia plunged into a savage drought, and in the southeast of the country it culminated in the Ash Wednesday bushfires of 1983, a firestorm that killed dozens of people in a single day. On the other side of the Pacific, the eastern side, the coast of Peru and Ecuador, was hammered by catastrophic flooding as the warm water fueled relentless storms. Damages worldwide ran into the billions of dollars. And the single most important lesson from 1982 was simple. We had been caught off guard. So the world built a real monitoring network across the tropical Pacific, a line of buoys specifically designed to make sure we would never be blindsided by one of these again. The reason we can even have today's conversation, the reason we can see this current event loading in advance, is because of the lesson taught by that one. Then came 1997 and 1998, and this is the one that, for many people, defined what a super El Niño even is. It peaked near plus 2.4 on the index, a genuine monster, and it played out under the full gaze of modern satellites for the entire world to watch. California was battered by storm after storm, East Africa flooded, Indonesia and the surrounding region baked under drought, and the planet's average temperature spiked so hard that 1998 became the hottest year that had ever been recorded up to that point, a record that stood for years. But the piece of that event I most want you to remember is what happened underwater, because it is the clearest warning of all. The heat injected into the world's oceans triggered the first truly global coral bleaching event ever documented. When water gets too warm, coral expels the tiny algae living inside it, the algae that give it both its colour and its food, and the coral turns ghostly white and begins to starve. In 1998, this happened everywhere at once. By the most cited estimates, around 16% of the world's coral reefs died in that single event. 16% of the living reef on the entire planet, gone in one warm pulse driven by one El Niño. Reefs that had taken thousands of years to grow were killed in a matter of weeks. And then, less than 20 years later, it happened again, bigger and better documented, and this is the event that actually gave us the nickname this whole video is built around. The El Niño of 2015 and 2016 peaked near plus 2.6, even stronger than 1997 by that measure, and a climatologist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory looked at the developing monster and called it a Godzilla. The name stuck because it fit. That event helped drive 2016 to become once again the hottest year ever recorded, blowing past the old marks. It fueled a devastating season of fires across Indonesia in late 2015, where peatlands burned and a choking haze spread across Southeast Asia for weeks. And it drove the third global coral bleaching event, the longest and one of the most severe on record, which tore through the Great Barrier Reef and killed a heartbreaking fraction of the coral across its northern reaches. Two super El Niños, less than 2 decades apart, and both of them left the same fingerprints. Record-breaking global heat, mass death on the reefs, drought and fire on one side of the Pacific, flood on the other. I want to make sure the pattern is landing because this is the entire point of looking backward. Every time this machine has spun up into the monster range, it has produced a remarkably consistent set of consequences. It pushes the global temperature to a new record because it is dumping ocean heat into the atmosphere. It kills coral on a massive scale because that same heat cooks the reefs. It dries out Australia, Indonesia, and parts of Africa and Asia, raising the risk of drought, crop failure, and fire, and it floods the Eastern Pacific and parts of the Americas. This is not a random grab bag. This is a signature, repeated across every strong event we have ever measured, all the way back to the famine that killed 50 million. It is, in a very real sense, a menu of what comes next, and the most recent reminder is the freshest of all. Just a couple of years ago, in 2023 and 2024, another El Niño, not even a true Godzilla, just a moderate to strong one, combined with the background warmth of the planet to help push global temperatures to yet another record. 2024 came in as the warmest calendar year ever measured, the first year to average roughly 1.5 degrees Celsius above where the planet sat before the Industrial Age. And that one was not even a monster. That was a middleweight El Niño punching above its class because of the warmer world it was riding on top of. Which raises the question that should be making the hair on your arm stand up right about now. If a moderate El Niño 2 years ago was enough to set an all-time heat record, what happens when a genuine Godzilla, the plus 2-point-something kind the models are hinting at, lands on a planet that is now even warmer than it was then? To answer that, we have to stop looking backward and start mapping it forward, region by region, across the whole planet, to see exactly where the next 3 years are likely to bend. Because El Niño does not treat everywhere the same. It picks favourites and it picks victims. Before we leave the modern monsters, I want to make sure one number from all of this has truly landed, because it reframes everything that comes after. In 1998, and again in 2016, the warmest year ever recorded at the time was set during an El Niño. Then in 2024, the record fell again, during a far weaker event. Notice the trend hiding in those 3 dates. The El Niños did not have to get stronger to keep breaking the record. The planet underneath them kept getting warmer, so weaker and weaker events kept setting new all-time highs. That is the quiet, relentless story underneath the dramatic one, and it is the reason a genuine Godzilla arriving now is such a serious prospect. We have watched moderate events break records on the strength of the warming floor alone. A monster on that same floor is reaching for numbers we have genuinely never seen. There is also a human rhythm to these events that the bare statistics miss. Each modern monster taught us something and left a mark on how the world prepares. 1982 taught us to build the buoys. 1997 taught a generation the very phrase El Niño, which entered everyday language for the first time. 2015 gave us the nickname Godzilla and the satellite imagery of burning peatlands that no one who saw it forgot. And 2023 and 24 taught us that the warming floor had risen so far that the old rules about how strong an event needed to break a record no longer applied. Each one was a lesson. The question now is whether we have actually learned them, or whether we'll simply add this next event to the list of things we saw coming and failed to take seriously enough. Part 5. How one ocean rewrites the whole planet. Let me give you the single most important idea for understanding what comes next, and then we will travel around the world with it. The idea is this: El Niño does not make the planet uniformly hotter, or wetter, or drier. What it does is rearrange where the rain falls. It takes the global pattern of wet places and dry places, picks it up, and shifts it. So for every region that suddenly gets too much water, there is another region that suddenly gets far too little. It is a redistribution, not an addition. And the technical word for these long-distance connections, the way a change in the Pacific reaches out and grabs the weather in a place thousands of miles away, is teleconnection. Tele meaning distant. The Pacific sneezes, and a farm in Australia or a city in Peru catches the cold. Once you understand the machine moves the atmosphere's engine eastward, every one of these connections starts to make sense, because they are all just consequences of that one relocation. We should start where the phenomenon got its name, on the western coast of South America, because this is where El Niño hits first and hits hardest in the most direct way. Remember that under normal conditions, the coast of Peru and Ecuador is cool, dry and fed by that upwelling of cold water from below. The coastal desert there is one of the driest places on Earth precisely because the cold ocean suppresses rainfall. Now flip on a strong El Niño. The warm water floods east and piles up against that coast. The cool, dry, rain-suppressing ocean becomes a warm, evaporating, storm-fueling ocean almost overnight, and the result is catastrophic flooding in one of the least rain-adapted places on the planet. Deserts that normally see almost no rain at all get hit with torrential downpours. Rivers that are usually dry beds turn into raging floods. Entire towns built on the assumption that it basically never rains get washed out. During the strongest events, the flooding and landslides along the Peruvian and Ecuadorian coast have killed people, destroyed infrastructure, and triggered outbreaks of waterborne disease. This is the most direct fingerprint of El Niño anywhere on Earth, and it is the original one, the one those fishermen named centuries ago. But the South American story is not just about the coast, and this is where you start to see the redistribution at work. While the coast of Peru drowns, other parts of the continent can dry out. The Amazon basin and parts of the north and northeast of the continent often swing toward drought during strong El Niños because the shifted atmospheric pattern starves them of their usual rainfall. So on a single continent you can have devastating floods in the west and deepening drought in the interior at the same time, both written by the same event. That is the redistribution in miniature, and if you scale that idea up to the whole planet, you start to understand how the 1877 catastrophe could strike India, China and Brazil all at once. The machine was doing the same thing it always does, just turned up to its most extreme setting. Now let me reconnect this to where we are right now, because it is easy to drift into history and forget the live signal. The reason any of this matters is that the index is sitting at plus 0.48 and climbing, with the models hinting at a monster. Everything I'm describing is not a guaranteed prophecy. It is the loaded set of probabilities that switches on as this event strengthens. The stronger it climbs toward that plus 2.0 Godzilla threshold, the more these historical patterns shift from possibility toward likelihood. A weak El Niño gently tilts the odds. A super El Niño slams them, and the forecasts are whispering that this one wants to be a super. There is one more piece of the South American and tropical Pacific story that deserves a moment, because it connects the human cost to the natural one, in a way that is almost poetic and almost cruel. The same warm water that floods the coast also kills the fishery. Remember the anchovies, the ones that thrive on the cold upwelling water. When the warm water shuts down that upwelling, the anchovies either die or flee to cooler depths, and the fishery that feeds both people and a global supply chain collapses. The most famous example came in the early 1970s, when a strong El Niño helped crash the Peruvian anchovy harvest, which at the time was one of the largest fisheries in the world. That crash sent shockwaves through global markets, because those fish were ground into fish meal that fed livestock around the planet. So the price of feed went up, which rippled into the price of meat on the other side of the world, all because the wind stopped blowing the right way across the equatorial Pacific. Hold on to that idea of a ripple that crosses the whole world from one ocean, because when we get to the economics later, it is going to come back even bigger. But first, we have to cross the Pacific to the other side, to the place that gets the exact opposite treatment, where the story is not too much water but far too little, and where the consequence is not flood but fire. it is worth pausing on the name itself for a moment, because there is a dark poetry in it that the fisherman who coined it never intended. El Niño means the boy, a reference to the Christ child, because the warm water tended to arrive around Christmas off the coast of Peru. But there is a second half to the family that we have only mentioned in passing, and its name carries its own meaning. The cold phase, the opposite swing of the seesaw, was later named La Niña, the girl, to complete the pair. Together they are the two faces of one oscillating system, the warm and the cold, the flood and the drought, the boy and the girl, trading places across the Pacific on a rhythm that runs for years. And what makes this current moment notable is exactly that we are watching the handoff happen in real time. The girl giving way to the boy, the cold giving way to the warm, faster than the system usually makes the trade. The fishermen named what they could see from their boats, the warm water at Christmas. They could not have known they were naming one half of the single most important climate pattern on the planet outside of the seasons themselves, but they felt it before any scientist understood it, because it took the fish, and the fish were their lives. Part 6. The Other Side of the World Catches Fire. If you want to see the redistribution in its purest form, you cross the Pacific from South America to Australia and Indonesia, because whatever El Niño gives to one side, it takes from the other. Remember that under normal conditions, the Western Pacific is where the warm pool sits, where the air rises, where the thunderstorms build, where the rain falls. Indonesia, the Philippines, Northern Australia and the surrounding seas live underneath that rising, raining engine. It is the wet end of the seesaw. Now strengthen an El Niño, slide that warm water and that rising air eastward into the central Pacific, and you have just pulled the engine away from the people who depend on it. The rain that was supposed to fall on Indonesia and Eastern Australia is now falling out in the middle of the ocean instead, and what is left behind is drought. In Australia, strong El Niño events are tightly linked to some of the worst droughts in the country's recorded history, and drought in Australia is not just an agricultural problem, it is a fire problem. When the land dries out, the eucalyptus forests and grasslands turn into fuel, and all it takes is a spark and a hot wind. I mentioned the Ash Wednesday fires of 1983 earlier, born out of that era's El Niño-driven drought, which killed dozens of people in a matter of hours. The late 1990s event brought brutal drought to eastern Australia as well. The connection is so reliable that Australian forecasters watch the state of the Pacific the way a doctor watches a patient's vital signs, because they know that a strong El Niño loads the entire continent toward a dangerous fire season. So when I tell you the index is climbing toward Godzilla territory, understand what that quietly means for the people living in the southeast of Australia. It means the coming fire seasons just got more dangerous, months before a single flame appears, decided by the temperature of an ocean to their northeast. Indonesia tells an even more visceral version of this story, and it comes with a particular kind of horror that you can actually see from space. Much of Indonesia sits on top of peat, which is essentially partially decomposed plant matter, layers and layers of it, holding enormous amounts of carbon and normally a great deal of water. During a strong El Niño, the rains fail, the peatlands dry out, and they become almost unimaginably flammable, and when they catch, they do not burn like a normal forest fire that races through and moves on. They smoulder, underground, sometimes for weeks or months, nearly impossible to extinguish, pouring out thick, toxic smoke. During the 2015 Godzilla event, the Indonesian fires were so enormous that the haze blanketed much of Southeast Asia for weeks. Air quality across multiple countries collapsed, schools closed, flights were grounded, and the amount of carbon those burning peatlands released on the worst days rivaled the daily emissions of entire major industrial economies. All of it triggered ultimately by a warm patch of water deciding the rain should fall somewhere else. I want to pause here and make the central point land again, because we are now 2 continents into the same idea and I do not want it to blur. Floods in Peru, drought and fire in Australia and Indonesia. These are not separate stories. They are 2 faces of one face. The exact same shift in the exact same ocean produces both, simultaneously, because El Niño is a redistribution machine. And the stronger it gets, the more extreme both ends of that seesaw become. That is precisely why a super El Niño is so much more dangerous than an ordinary one. It is not just a little wetter here and a little drier there. It pushes both extremes toward their breaking points at the same time, on opposite sides of the planet, in places that will never know they're connected. The Peruvian farmer bailing water out of his home and the Australian family watching a fire front climb the ridge behind their town are living through the same event. They just feel it as opposites. And the reach does not stop at the Pacific Rim. The drought signal extends across the wider region during strong events, into parts of Southeast Asia, into the Indian subcontinent, into the agricultural heartlands that feed billions of people. This is the thread that connects the modern fire and flood story back to the famine of 1877, because the mechanism that failed the monsoon then is the same mechanism stressing these regions now. The difference is that today we can see it coming and, in theory, prepare. Whether we actually do is a different question, and it is the one this whole story keeps circling back to. So far we have watched El Niño drown one coast and ignite another, and we have not even reached the part of the world where most of the people watching this video actually live. Because North America does not get a simple story. It does not get just flood or just drought. It gets split right down the middle, and which half you end up on depends entirely on where you're standing. The Asian dimension of the dry side deserves a little more attention, because it is where the sheer number of exposed people is highest. Across much of Southeast Asia, from the rice paddies of the Mekong region to the plantations that supply a huge share of the world's palm oil, a strong El Niño tilts the odds toward drought, lower river levels, and stressed harvests. Lower river levels are not only an agricultural problem either. Across this part of the world, rivers mean hydropower, and they mean transport. When a strong El Niño drops the water levels, it can crimp electricity generation and snarl the movement of goods along rivers that entire economies depend on. So the dryness does not stay in the fields. It reaches into the power grid and the shipping lanes, which is one more way a single ocean anomaly turns into a tangle of problems that look, on the surface, completely unrelated to the weather. There is a grim feedback inside the Australian and Indonesian fire story that is worth spelling out, because it shows how an El Niño can reach beyond its own lifetime. When those peatlands and forests burn during a strong event, they release an enormous pulse of carbon into the atmosphere, carbon that had been locked away for centuries or longer. That released carbon does not simply vanish when the rains finally return and the fires go out. It joins the warming floor we keep coming back to, nudging the baseline a little higher for everyone everywhere for years to come. So a single strong El Niño does not just cause a bad fire season. It can leave the planet's atmosphere marginally warmer afterward, which makes the next event's spike reach a little higher on a slightly taller floor. It is a small effect from any single event, but stacked across many events it is one more way the system can feed on itself, and one more reason scientists watch these fire seasons with an attention that goes well beyond the immediate flames. The smoke clears, but some of what the fire release stays in the sky, quietly raising the stakes for next time. Part 7. North America gets split down the middle. If you live in the United States or Canada, El Niño does something to your weather that is genuinely strange. It draws a line across the continent and treats the two halves like different planets. And the reason comes back, as always, to where the atmosphere's engine has moved. When that warm water and rising air slide into the central and eastern Pacific, they energize one of the most important features in North American weather, the subtropical jet stream, the river of fast wind that flows across the southern tier of the continent. During a strong El Niño, that southern jet wakes up, strengthens, and steers storm after storm across the south, while the northern branch of the jet often retreats and leaves the top of the continent quieter and milder. So the continent splits. Across the southern United States, from California through the southwest, across Texas, the Gulf Coast, and into the southeast, a strong El Niño winter tends to run wetter and cooler than normal. That energized southern jet acts like a fire hose aimed at the southern states, delivering parade after parade of storms. For California, this is the headline. After the dry years that the cold phase of the cycle often brings, a strong El Niño can flip the state into a deluge, and the storms can stack up so relentlessly that the real danger becomes flooding, mudslides, and the kind of saturated ground disasters that happen when months of rain arrive in weeks. The 1997 and 1998 event hammered California exactly this way. So if this current signal climbs into the strong or super range, the coming wet season across the southern tier of North America is the thing to watch, and the word to keep in mind is not drought, but flood. Meanwhile, the northern half of the continent often gets the opposite. The northern states, the Pacific Northwest, the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, and much of Canada tend to run milder and drier during a strong El Niño winter. For some people that sounds like a gift. A gentler winter, lower heating bills, less snow to shovel. But mild and dry is not free. A dry northern winter means a thinner snowpack, and across the west, the snowpack is the water supply. The snow that piles up in the mountains over winter is what slowly melts and feeds the rivers and reservoirs through the following summer. A skimpy El Niño snowpack in the north can set up water shortages and a worse fire season the next year. So even the half of the continent that gets the so-called easy version of El Niño is quietly being handed a bill that comes due months later. There is no free side of this seesaw. There is only the side where the cost is obvious and the side where it is delayed. Now I have to address the one that everyone always asks about, which is hurricanes, because here El Niño does something genuinely helpful for one region while making things worse for another, and it is a perfect closing example of the redistribution principle. A strong El Niño tends to suppress Atlantic hurricane activity. The mechanism is something called wind shear. As that energized atmospheric pattern sets up, it increases the high-altitude winds over the Atlantic, and strong high-altitude wind is poison to a developing hurricane, because it tears the storm apart vertically before it can organize and intensify. So for the Gulf Coast and the East Coast of the United States, a strong El Niño is, on balance, often a quieter Atlantic hurricane season, and that is genuinely good news. But, and you knew there was a but, the same conditions that calm the Atlantic tend to fire up the Eastern Pacific, where hurricane activity can increase, threatening Mexico, Central America, and sometimes sending moisture and storms toward the southwestern United States. Even the hurricanes get redistributed. The Atlantic exhales while the Pacific inhales. There is that machine again, giving with one hand and taking with the other, never adding, only moving. So let me stitch this back to the live signal one more time, because the whole point of mapping these regions is to understand what the next year or two could actually deliver. As this El Niño strengthens, the loaded outcomes for North America come into focus. A wetter, flood-prone winter across the south, with California squarely in the crosshairs. A milder, drier north that quietly mortgages next summer's water and fire risk. A potentially calmer Atlantic hurricane season, paired with a more active Eastern Pacific. None of these are certainties. All of them are probabilities that get heavier the closer the index climbs to that Godzilla threshold. But North America, for all its drama, actually gets off relatively easy compared to some places, because it is wealthy, it has the infrastructure, and it can absorb a bad season. The places where a strong El Niño becomes a matter of survival, rather than inconvenience, are the places where the rain that fails is the rain that grows the food. And that brings us to the part of the planet where the stakes are highest of all, and where the ghost of 1877 still has the most to teach us. California deserves a closer look here, because it is the part of North America where a strong El Niño can swing most violently from one extreme to the other, and where the most people are exposed to the result. The mechanism that drives those wet El Niño winters is something you have probably heard named in recent years, the atmospheric river, a long narrow corridor of moisture in the sky that can carry as much water as a great river on the ground, aimed straight at the coast. A strong El Niño, with that energized southern jet stream, tends to point these atmospheric rivers at California one after another, and the danger is in the stacking. One atmospheric river is a storm, several in a row, landing on ground that is already saturated with mountain snowpack melting underneath, is how you get the kind of flooding, mudslides, and infrastructure failure that defines the worst El Niño winters in the state's history. The cruel irony is that a region that spends the dry phase of the cycle desperate for water can, in a strong El Niño, get a year's worth of it in a few brutal weeks, in a form that does more harm than good. Too little, then far too much. That whiplash, from drought to deluge, is one of the signatures of a strengthening event, and it is one of the things the southern tier of the continent should be watching for as this signal climbs. Part 8, where the rain that fails is the rain that feeds billions. For most of the people watching this, a bad El Niño means a weird winter, a higher grocery bill, maybe a rough fire season a state or two away. But for a significant fraction of humanity, a strong El Niño means something far more elemental. It means the rain that grows the food might not come. And nowhere is that more true than across the band of the world that runs from Africa through the Indian subcontinent into Southeast Asia, where hundreds of millions of people still depend directly on seasonal rains arriving on schedule. This is where El Niño stops being a weather curiosity and becomes a question of food security, and it is where the lesson of 1877 is not history at all. It is a live risk. Start with Africa, because the continent gets split much like North America does into a wet half and a dry half. During strong El Niño events, East Africa, countries like Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia often swings toward heavier rainfall and flooding. That sounds like it might be good news for a dry region, but flooding brings its own disasters, washing out crops, spreading waterborne disease, and displacing people. Meanwhile, Southern Africa, countries like Zimbabwe, Zambia, and South Africa, tends to swing the other way, toward drought. And Southern Africa's drought is an agricultural emergency, because the region's staple crops depend on that summer rainfall. A strong El Niño drought there can devastate the maize harvest across multiple countries at once, driving food prices up and pushing vulnerable populations toward hunger. We have watched this happen in recent strong events, with tens of millions of people across southern Africa needing food assistance after El Niño-linked droughts hammered their harvests. The mechanism is identical to the one that struck a century and a half ago, only the response has changed. Then there is India and the Indian monsoon, which may be the single most consequential weather event on the entire planet for human life. More than 1 billion people depend, in one way or another, on that monsoon arriving and delivering its rain across the summer. The agricultural calendar of the subcontinent, the water supply, the hydropower, the entire rhythm of life is built around it. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the historical record makes unavoidable. Strong El Niño events are statistically linked to weaker monsoons and a higher risk of drought across India. Not every El Niño weakens the monsoon, and the relationship is not a guarantee, because other factors in the Indian Ocean can push back. But the tilt is real, and it is exactly the tilt that, in its most extreme form in 1877, failed the monsoon completely and contributed to the deaths of millions. So when forecasters in India see a strong El Niño developing in the Pacific, they watch the coming monsoon with a particular kind of attention, because they know what is at stake if the rains come up short. Now I want to be very clear and very honest, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a channel like this one could tip into fear-mongering, and I refuse to do that. I'm not telling you that a famine is coming. I'm telling you the opposite of the 1877 lesson is also true. We are not the Victorians. The world today has global grain markets that can move food from surplus regions to deficit regions. It has months of advance warning from the very monitoring systems that this signal is showing up on. It has international relief organisations, buffer stocks, and drought-resistant crop varieties that did not exist in the past. A strong El Niño today lands on a world far better equipped to absorb it. The reason the modern monsters killed thousands instead of tens of millions is not that they were weaker. Several of them were just as strong as 1877, or stronger. The reason is that the human systems underneath them were stronger. That is the whole game. But, and this is the thread that ties it all together, that protection is not automatic and it is not evenly distributed. The regions most exposed to El Niño drought are often the regions least able to afford a failed harvest, the places where a bad season still means real hunger because the buffers are thin. So the honest forward-looking picture is this. As this El Niño strengthens toward the range the models are hinting at, the risk of simultaneous agricultural stress across southern Africa, parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia rises in lockstep. It is not a prophecy of catastrophe. It is a rising probability of strain on the global food system, concentrated on the people with the least cushion. And strain on the food system does not stay politely in one place. It moves through prices, through markets, through economies, all the way to the grocery store where you actually shop. So let us follow that thread next, out of the fields and into the money, because the cost of a Godzilla El Niño is not only measured in rainfall and harvests, it is measured in dollars, and the bill lands in some surprising places. There is a human health chapter to all of this that often gets overlooked, and it deserves a place in any honest accounting, because El Niño does not only move rain and money, it moves disease. The flooding that strong events bring to places like the eastern Pacific coast and East Africa creates ideal conditions for waterborne illness, and strong El Niños have been linked to outbreaks of cholera and other diseases that thrive when floodwater contaminates drinking water. The shifting rainfall also reshapes the territory of mosquitoes, which can change the patterns of malaria and dengue, sometimes igniting outbreaks in regions during and after a strong event. In East Africa, the heavy El Niño rains have been tied to outbreaks of a disease called Rift Valley fever, which moves through both livestock and people. So when the rain belts shift, the map of disease shifts with them. It is one more teleconnection, just a biological one, and it falls, like so much of this, hardest on the places with the least capacity to respond. Part 9. The reefs go white and the seas go quiet. Of all the consequences a Super El Niño leaves behind, the one that may be the most permanent, the hardest to undo, is what it does underwater. We touched on it earlier, the coral bleaching, but I want to come back to it and really sit with it, because it is the clearest example of how a temperature change you could barely notice can kill something that took thousands of years to build. And it is the part of this story where the word recovery starts to lose its meaning. Here is what is actually happening when a reef bleaches. Coral, the living animal, has a partnership with tiny algae that live inside its tissue. Those algae are not just decoration. They photosynthesize, they capture sunlight, and they hand most of that energy to the coral as food. They are also what give coral its colour. It is one of the most successful partnerships in the history of life, and it is the engine that built the largest living structures on the planet. But it is also fragile, and it is fragile in one specific way. It cannot take much heat. When the surrounding water climbs just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius above the normal summer maximum and stays there for a few weeks, the partnership breaks down. The algae start producing toxic compounds under heat stress, and the coral expels them. Without the algae, the coral loses its colour and turns bone white, which is where the term bleaching comes from. And without the algae, the coral also loses most of its food supply. It is now starving. Bleaching is not instant death. If the water cools back down quickly enough, the coral can take its algae back and recover, though it is left weakened and vulnerable. But if the heat lingers, which is exactly what a strong El Niño guarantees, the coral starves, disease moves in, and it dies. And when it dies, the entire city built on it begins to collapse, because a coral reef is not just the coral. It is the foundation for 1/4 of all marine species at some point in their lives. The fish, the invertebrates, the entire web of life that depends on the reef for shelter and food, all of it unravels when the foundation dies. So when I told you that around 16% of the world's reefs died in the single El Niño of 1998, understand that this was not 16% of some inert rock. It was 16% of the living foundation of a huge fraction of ocean life, killed in one warm pulse. And the 2015 and 2016 Godzilla drove the longest global bleaching event ever recorded, savaging the Great Barrier Reef so badly that enormous stretches of its northern section simply died. Now here is why this matters more with every passing event, and why this one frightens reef scientists in a way the 1997 event did not. The danger to coral is not just the El Niño spike, it is the El Niño spike landing on top of an ocean that is already, on average, warmer than it used to be. The background temperature of the sea has been climbing, so the reefs are already living closer to their thermal limit than they were a few decades ago, which means the El Niño pulse does not have to do as much work to push them over the edge. It is like the difference between a heat wave hitting a healthy person and the same heat wave hitting someone already running a fever. The same spike does far more damage when the baseline is already elevated, and the baseline today is higher than it was during any previous Super El Niño we have on record. That is the core reason this event carries a particular dread for anyone who studies the reefs, and we will come back to that elevated baseline in a moment, because it is the single most important reason this El Niño could outpunch its predecessors. The reefs are the most dramatic underwater casualty, but they are not the only one. Strong El Niño events drive marine heat waves, enormous patches of abnormally warm ocean that disrupt entire ecosystems. Fish populations shift, chasing the cooler water they need, which scrambles fisheries and the communities that depend on them. We already talked about the anchovies off Peru, but the same kind of disruption can ripple through fisheries across the Pacific and beyond. Seabirds and marine mammals that depend on those fish go hungry. And the ocean, which is the planet's great regulator, the thing that has quietly absorbed most of the excess heat humanity has generated, gets pushed and stressed in ways we are still learning to measure. So when you hold the live signal in your mind, the index at plus 0.48 and climbing, understand that one of the things it is quietly threatening is another mass casualty event on the reefs, another round of marine disruption, landing on ocean ecosystems that are already more stressed than they have ever been in the span of human observation. And unlike a flooded town or a failed harvest, which a society can rebuild or replant in a year, a reef that dies may take decades to recover, if it recovers at all. Some of what a super El Niño kills does not come back on any timescale that matters to us. The cascade does not stop at the coral either, because when the foundation of the reef goes, the collapse climbs up through everything that depended on it. The fish that sheltered in the reef lose their homes and their nurseries, so their numbers fall, which means the larger fish and the seabirds and the marine mammals that ate them go hungry too. During the strongest events, seabird colonies have suffered catastrophic breeding failures and mass die-offs, simply because the fish they needed vanished into deeper, cooler water or died off entirely. Whole stretches of coastline that depended on the predictable arrival of marine life have watched it simply not show up. This is the part of an El Niño that never makes a headline, because it happens out at sea, away from cameras, and it unfolds over months rather than in a single dramatic moment. But it is real, it is large, and after the strongest events it can take an ocean ecosystem years to climb back toward where it started, assuming it climbs back at all. The ocean absorbs the blow quietly, and we mostly only learn the size of it later, when the fishing fleets come back with empty holds. Part 10. Follow the money and it leads everywhere. We have talked about floods, fires, droughts, and dead reefs, and it would be easy to think of El Niño as purely a natural disaster, something that happens to farmers and fishermen and coastlines far away. But a strong El Niño is also one of the largest economic events on the planet, and its costs and, strangely, some of its benefits ripple through the global economy in ways that eventually reach your wallet, wherever you happen to live. Because in a connected world, a failed harvest on one continent is a price increase on another, and the machine that moves rain around the planet also indirectly moves money. Let me start with the most direct channel, which is food. When a strong El Niño stresses agriculture across multiple regions at once, drought in southern Africa, a weakened monsoon in South Asia, dryness across parts of Southeast Asia and Australia, it can dent the global supply of key commodities. Crops like wheat, rice, sugar, coffee, cocoa, and palm oil all have major growing regions that sit squarely in El Niño's zone of influence. When the harvest in those regions come up short, the global price of those commodities can climb, and that increase flows through the supply chain into the price of food everywhere, including in wealthy countries that were never touched by the drought itself. So a person in a city that had a perfectly pleasant El Niño winter can still end up paying more for chocolate, coffee and sugar because the rains failed thousands of miles away. The ripple I asked you to remember from the anchovy collapse is the same ripple, just scaled up across the entire food system. But here is where it gets genuinely counterintuitive, and where I want to be careful and accurate because the economics of El Niño are not a simple story of universal loss. Researchers who have studied the global economic effects, including a well-known body of work by economists examining how El Niño moves national economies, have found that the impact is deeply uneven. Some economies actually come out slightly ahead. The United States, for instance, has in some past events seen a small net economic benefit, partly because a milder northern winter reduces heating costs and energy demand, and partly because certain agricultural regions can actually do better under El Niño conditions. In one strong event, economies like the United States and Mexico saw a small boost to their growth, while at the very same time, economies like India, Australia, and parts of southern Africa saw their growth fall as drought hammered their farms. So El Niño does not just redistribute rainfall, it redistributes economic fortune, handing a small advantage to some countries while imposing real costs on others, often the ones least able to bear them. It is the seesaw again, this time measured in growth rather than rain. That unevenness is the part I most want you to hold on to, because it shapes how the world responds, and frankly, how seriously different places take the threat. If you live in a country that has historically come out roughly even, or even slightly ahead, it is easy to treat a strong El Niño as a curiosity, a bit of interesting weather news. But the global picture is one of concentrated harm. The damage piles up on agricultural economies, on coastal communities exposed to flooding, on fishing fleets, on the reinsurance industry that has to pay out for the disasters, and above all on vulnerable populations whose food security sits closest to the edge. The total bill for the largest past events has run well into the tens of billions of dollars, and that is only the part we can easily count. It does not capture the long tail of a dead reef, a collapsed fishery, or a child who went hungry during a drought year and carried the consequences for life. So let me pull this whole world tour back to the central thread before we turn the corner toward the future, because we have now circled the entire planet, and the pattern should be unmistakable. One patch of warm water in the Pacific sliding east, dragging the atmosphere's engine with it, and from that single shift comes flood in Peru, fire in Australia, smoke over Indonesia, drought in southern Africa, a threatened monsoon in India, a split continent in North America, dead coral across the tropics, disrupted fisheries, and a price shock that crosses every border on Earth. That is what a strong El Niño does. That is the receipt. And the signal that decides how much of this bill actually comes due is sitting at plus 0.48 right now, and climbing toward the range that, historically, has triggered the worst of it. Which leaves us with the two questions that actually matter for what comes next. The first is whether this one could somehow be worse than the monsters that came before it. And the unsettling answer, for reasons that have nothing to do with the El Niño itself, is yes. The insurance industry sees all of this with a clarity the rest of us usually lack, because it is the industry that has to pay for the damage, and money has a way of cutting through abstraction. When a strong El Niño is forecast, the reinsurance companies, the firms that insure the insurers, begin modelling the elevated risk of floods, droughts and crop failures around the world, because they know the historical record better than almost anyone, and they price it into their decisions. The total insured and uninsured losses from the largest past events have run into the tens of billions of dollars, and that figure captures only what can be tallied on a balance sheet. It does not capture the uninsured subsistence farmer whose entire year is wiped out, or the long-term cost of a child's health damaged during a hungry season, or the value of a reef that will not regrow in a human lifetime. The measurable bill is enormous, and it's still only the visible tip of the true cost. Energy markets feel it too, in ways that touch ordinary household budgets. A milder El Niño winter across the northern United States and Europe can lower demand for heating fuel, easing some prices, while the heat and drought on the other side of the world can strain electricity grids and drive up demand for cooling. The drought-driven loss of hydropower in regions that depend on it can force a switch to more expensive fuels, raising costs, so even the energy you use is quietly nudged by the state of a distant ocean. The point of piling all of this up is not to overwhelm you. It is to make a single idea undeniable. There is almost no corner of modern human life, not the food you eat, not the price you pay, not the power in your wall, not the diseases that circulate, that a strong El Niño leaves entirely untouched. It is, in the most literal sense, a global event, and that is precisely why a potential monster deserves the attention this video is giving it. Part 11. The hotter floor. Underneath the spike. Here is the single most important reason a strong El Niño in 2026 is more dangerous than an equally strong El Niño in 1997, and it has almost nothing to do with the El Niño itself. It has to do with what is underneath it. Think of El Niño as a spike of heat that gets added on top of the planet's normal temperature. The size of the spike depends on how strong the event is, but the height that spike reaches depends on where the floor is to begin with, and the floor has been rising. The background temperature of the entire planet today sits somewhere around 1 1/3 to 1.5 degrees Celsius above where it was before the Industrial Age. So when this El Niño adds its spike, it is adding it on top of a floor that is already higher than it has ever been during any super El Niño we have ever measured. Let me make that concrete, because it is the difference between an abstract statistic and a genuine warning. Imagine two identical El Niño events, each adding exactly the same spike of heat. The first one happens in 1997 on the old lower floor. The second one happens today on the new higher floor. Even though the spikes are identical, the second event reaches a higher absolute temperature because it started from higher up. That is why I told you earlier that 2024 set an all-time global heat record on the back of an El Niño that was not even a true monster. It did not need to be a monster. The floor had risen so much that even a moderate spike was enough to break the record. So now run the experiment the models are hinting at. Take a genuine Godzilla, a plus 2-point-something spike, and stack it on top of today's already record-high floor. The absolute temperatures that combination could reach are, frankly, into territory the planet has not seen in the entire span of instrumental measurement. This is the part that should command your attention, not because it guarantees catastrophe, but because it is simple arithmetic. A big spike on a high floor reaches higher than a big spike on a low floor. There is nothing speculative about it. And this elevated floor does not just raise the temperature numbers, it amplifies the damage in a way that follows a clean physical law, one worth knowing because it explains so much. The law is sometimes called the Clausius-Clapeyron relation, and the simple version is this. For every 1 degree Celsius that the air warms, it can hold roughly 7% more water vapour. That number, 7% per degree, quietly drives a lot of what we have talked about. More water vapour in a warmer atmosphere means that when it does rain, it can rain harder, dumping more water in less time, which is why floods get more extreme. But it also means that in the dry regions, the warmer, thirstier atmosphere pulls moisture out of the soil and plants faster, which makes droughts more punishing. So the same warming that intensifies the floods on one side of the seesaw also intensifies the droughts on the other side. The elevated floor does not just make El Niño's spike reach higher, it sharpens both edges of the blade. Now bring this all the way back to the reefs for a moment, because this is where the elevated floor turns lethal in the most direct way. I told you that coral bleaches when the water climbs a degree or two above the normal summer maximum and stays there. Well, if the baseline ocean temperature has already crept upward, then the reefs are already sitting closer to that bleaching threshold before the El Niño even arrives. The event does not have to push as hard to cause catastrophe, because the reefs were already near the edge. The same logic applies to human heat. The deadly heat waves that strong El Niños can amplify in places like South Asia are landing on populations who are already experiencing hotter, baseline summers than their grandparents did. The El Niño is the spike, but the floor is what determines whether that spike crosses the line from dangerous to deadly. And the floor has never been higher. So when you put it all together, the case that this El Niño could outpunch its historical predecessors does not rest on the El Niño being stronger than 1997 or 2015. It might be, or it might not be. The case rests on the fact that whatever strength it reaches, it is reaching it on top of the warmest planet in the entire record. Same machine, same redistribution, same teleconnections, all of it now operating from a higher and more dangerous starting point. That is the sober, arithmetic reason the scientists watching this signal are uneasy. But there is also a second, more speculative reason that some researchers are uneasy, a reason that is not yet settled science, that lives out on the frontier of what we understand, and it asks a genuinely unsettling question. What if the warming planet is not just raising the floor underneath El Niño, but actually changing the machine itself, making the monsters more frequent and more violent than they used to be? I want to add one more honest note about that elevated floor, because it is where the natural and the human-made parts of this story meet, and I do not want to blur them. El Niño itself is entirely natural. The warming floor it now stands on is not. The roughly 1 1/3 to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming that has raised the baseline is the human-made part, the result of the heat-trapping gases we have added to the atmosphere. So what we are really watching is a collision between an ancient natural rhythm and a brand new human-made backdrop. The oscillation is the same one the fishermen named centuries ago. The stage it now performs on is one no previous El Niño in human history has ever stood upon. That is the honest synthesis, and it refuses to fit neatly into either camp. It is not all natural, and it is not all our doing. It is a natural monster, amplified by a human-built flaw, and the consequences that follow belong to both at once. Pretending it is purely one or the other is the single most common way this entire subject gets distorted, in both directions, and I am not willing to do that to you. Part 12. The Frontier and the Limits of What We Know. I want to take you now into more speculative territory, and I am going to flag it clearly the entire way through, because this is exactly the kind of idea that gets twisted into certainty by people who should know better, and I'm not going to do that to you. This is a hypothesis. It is being actively studied. It is not settled, the experts do not agree on it, and you should hold it loosely. But it is real science being done by serious people, and it is worth understanding, because if it turns out to be right, it changes the stakes of everything we have discussed. The question is this: we have been treating El Niño as a stable, natural oscillation that swings back and forth on its own rhythm, the same machine the Peruvian fishermen named centuries ago. But what if a rapidly changing planet is altering that machine? Specifically, some researchers have been investigating whether the dramatic loss of ice in the Arctic far to the north could be reaching all the way down to the tropics and changing how El Niño behaves, potentially making strong events more frequent or more intense. The idea is that the Arctic and the tropics are not isolated from each other. They are connected through the great looping patterns of the atmosphere. So when you melt an enormous amount of ice at the top of the world, you change the temperature contrasts that drive those patterns, and the effects can propagate in ways that are genuinely difficult to fully trace. A few scientists have suggested that this could be one reason we seem to be seeing these powerful events arrive in relatively quick succession, and one possible reason this current event is loading so fast on the heels of a La Niña. I have to be honest and tell you that this is contested, and that the honest scientific position right now is uncertainty. The El Niño machine is influenced by many things. The relationship is tangled, and pulling out a single clean cause and effect line from the Arctic to the equator is extraordinarily hard to do with confidence. Some researchers find a signal, others are skeptical, and the only intellectually honest thing I can tell you is that we will not know whether this specific event is part of some new amplified pattern for years, maybe decades, because you need a long string of these events to tell the difference between a genuine trend and ordinary bad luck. So file this one under fascinating, plausible, and unproven. It is a thread to watch, not a conclusion to believe. But the very fact that serious scientists are asking whether the machine itself is changing, on top of everything else, tells you something about the moment we are in. And this brings me to the most important caveat in this entire video, the one I need you to carry out the door more than any single number. Everything I have described, the floods, the fires, the droughts, the famine risk, the dead reefs, all of it, is a matter of probability, not certainty. El Niño does not guarantee any specific local outcome. It loads the dice. It does not promise that Australia burns, or that the monsoon fails, or that California floods. It raises the odds of those things, sometimes dramatically, but the atmosphere is a chaotic system, and other factors can push back. There have been strong El Niños, where a particular expected impact simply did not show up, because some other piece of the climate puzzle happened to counteract it. So anyone who tells you, with total confidence, exactly what is going to happen in your specific town because of this, El Niño is selling you something. The truth is humbler and, in a way, more unsettling. We can see the dice being loaded. We can even count how heavily, but we cannot tell you exactly how they will land. There is also a hard limit on how far ahead we can see, and it has a name. Forecasters call it the spring predictability barrier. For reasons rooted in the physics of the system, El Niño forecasts made in the spring, looking ahead through the summer, carry more uncertainty than forecasts made later in the year. We are essentially at the moment of maximum uncertainty about exactly how strong this event will ultimately become. The ocean has not finished loading. The feedback loop is still running. So the central tension of this entire story is that the signal that decides the fate of the next few years is forming right now, in real time, at the exact moment when our ability to predict its final strength is at its weakest. We can see that something big is coming. We cannot yet see how big. And by the time the uncertainty resolves and we know for sure whether this is a Godzilla or merely a strong event, the thing will already be upon us. So the only sane posture is not panic and not denial, but preparation, watching the signal, and refusing to be caught off guard the way the world was in 1982, which raises one last set of questions we have to clear away before we look at the road ahead, because whenever a story like this gets big, the noise gets loud, and some of that noise needs to be answered head-on. It is worth being honest too about the times the forecasts have been wrong, because that uncertainty cuts both ways and it keeps us humble. There was a year, not long ago, when the models loudly forecast a strong El Niño, the warnings went out, the headlines were written, and then the event fizzled into something far more modest than predicted, because a piece of the atmosphere refused to cooperate and the feedback loop never fully caught. Forecasters call setups like that a bust, and they are a genuine feature of this science, not a bug. They are the direct consequence of the spring predictability barrier and the chaotic nature of the system. So when I tell you this current signal is climbing toward monster territory, I am telling you what the data and the odds show right now, not handing you a guarantee. It could verify as a genuine Godzilla. It could also strengthen into a strong but ordinary event or even stall. The honest forecaster holds all of those possibilities at once, watches the buoys, and updates as the ocean reveals its hand. Certainty is the one thing this science cannot honestly sell, and anyone who offers it to you is not being straight with you. I also want to name a quieter myth, the most seductive one of all, which is the belief that because we can now see El Niño coming, we have somehow tamed it. We have not. Seeing a thing and stopping a thing are entirely different powers, and we hold only the first. There is no switch, no lever, no technology on Earth, or on any drawing board that can slow the warm water sliding east, or talk the trade winds back into place. The machine is far beyond our reach, and it always has been. What we have gained is not control. It is foresight, and foresight is a strange kind of gift, because it places the responsibility squarely back on us. A society that cannot see a disaster coming can at least claim it was blameless when the disaster strikes. A society that can see it coming, months in advance, with buoys and satellites and a century of hard-won understanding, has no such excuse. The warning removes the alibi, so the deepest truth of this whole story is not that we have mastered El Niño, it is that we have run out of reasons to be surprised by it, which means that whatever the next 3 years bring, the outcome will be, more than ever before, a measure of what we chose to do with the time the warning bought us. Part 13. Clearing the Noise. Whenever something this big starts loading in the Pacific, the internet fills up with explanations that sound compelling and are completely wrong, and part of doing this honestly is meeting those head-on rather than pretending they do not exist. So let me take the 3 big ones in turn, because each of them contains a grain of something true wrapped around a center that the data simply does not support. The first one you will hear is that this is the sun. Whenever the planet does something dramatic, someone insists the sun must be behind it, and I understand the instinct, because the sun is the ultimate source of nearly all the energy in our weather. But here is the beautiful thing about timing, and it is the reason I love covering this particular story right now. As I record this, the sun is quiet, genuinely quiet. The geomagnetic activity is sitting at the bottom of the scale. There are no major eruptions aimed at Earth, and the strongest solar event of the moment is a minor flare that did essentially nothing. So we have a perfect natural experiment unfolding in front of us. The Pacific is loading a potential monster, while the sun is sitting on its hands. If the sun were driving this, we would expect to see the sun doing something dramatic, and it is not. The truth is that El Niño is an internal process. It is the ocean and the atmosphere of this planet talking to each other, exchanging heat and momentum in that self-feeding Bjerknes loop we walked through. The energy was already here, stored in the Pacific. El Niño is not the sun injecting new energy. It is the Earth rearranging energy it already had, ready. The quiet sun overhead this week is the cleanest possible proof of that. The second claim, and this one comes up every single time, is that someone is doing this on purpose, that it is weather modification, or cloud seeding, or that mysterious antenna array in Alaska that gets blamed for basically everything secretly steering the ocean. And I want to address this with respect rather than mockery, because the underlying worry, the sense that powerful forces are messing with systems we depend on, is an understandable human anxiety. But the rebuttal here is not opinion, it is arithmetic, specifically an energy budget. El Niño involves the redistribution of an almost unimaginable amount of heat, stored in the upper layers of the largest ocean on the entire planet, across a region that spans a quarter of the way around the globe. The amount of energy involved dwarfs anything human technology can produce or move by many, many orders of magnitude. Cloud seeding, the real technology, can coax a little extra precipitation out of a cloud that was already primed to rain. It cannot create a cloud, and it certainly cannot warm a basin-sized swathe of ocean. That facility in Alaska heats a tiny patch of the upper atmosphere for research and could not move a Pacific warm pool if you ran it for 1,000 years. The machine we spent this whole video describing, the trade winds, the warm pool, the thermocline, the feedback loop, is self-driving. It does not need a human hand, and there is no human hand capable of turning it. The honest, and frankly more humbling truth is that this is far bigger than us. The third claim sits at the opposite end, and it is the one that says this is all overblown, that El Niño is just normal, natural variability being hyped into a crisis to scare you. And here is where I have to be fair, because this objection contains the most truth of the three. El Niño is natural. It is a genuine, recurring oscillation that has been swinging back and forth for thousands of years, long before humans burned a single lump of coal. The skeptic who says this is not some unprecedented man-made monster is, on that narrow point, correct. But here is where the argument falls apart. Natural does not mean harmless. The 1877 famine was natural. It still killed tens of millions of people. The reefs that died in 1998 died from a natural oscillation. They are still dead. The fact that something has happened before, on its own, for natural reasons, is not remotely the same as the fact that it is safe. Earthquakes are natural. Volcanic eruptions are natural. We do not shrug those off because they are not man-made. So the honest framing, the one that holds both truths at once, is this. El Niño is a real, natural, recurring phenomenon, and its strongest expressions have repeatedly been among the deadliest weather events in human history. Both of those things are true at the same time, and you do not have to choose between them. So strip away the noise and what are you left with? Not a solar conspiracy, not a secret weather weapon, not a harmless non-event. You are left with exactly what the data shows, which is a powerful natural system loading fast on top of the warmest planet we have ever measured, with a track record of reorganizing the weather of entire continents and a real, if uncertain, chance of climbing into the most dangerous category we have a name for. That is the genuine story, and it is more than dramatic enough without any of the myths attached, which means we can finally turn and face forward toward the actual question the title of this video asked. Here is what comes next. Not the fantasy version, not the doom version, but the grounded, most likely version of how the next 3 years could unfold if this signal keeps climbing. Part 14. The next 3 years. So let us map the road ahead, using everything the historical record and the physics have taught us, and let us be honest about both the timeline and the uncertainty. Strong El Niño events follow a fairly reliable life cycle, and that cycle tells us roughly when to expect what. These events typically continue to strengthen through the second half of the year, reach their peak intensity around the middle of the Northern Hemisphere winter, usually somewhere between November and January, and then gradually decay through the following spring. So if this current signal behaves like its predecessors, the back half of 2026 is the strengthening phase, the turn into 2027 is when it likely reaches its most powerful point, and the rest of 2027 is the long decay. That is the window. That is when the loaded outcomes we have discussed move from possibility toward reality, if they move at all. Walk it forward season by season, and the picture comes into focus. Through the rest of this year, as the event strengthens, the first signals would show up where El Niño always shows up first, in the Pacific and along its rim. Watch the Eastern Pacific for an active hurricane season, and the Western Pacific Rim, Australia and Indonesia, for deepening dryness and rising fire risk heading into their dangerous season. Then, as the calendar turns toward winter and the event peaks, the bigger teleconnections engage. That is when North America's split would sharpen, with the wet, stormy, flood-prone pattern setting up across the southern United States and California, and the milder, drier pattern across the north. That is when the Atlantic hurricane season, by then likely winding down, would have felt the suppressing hand of the shear. And that is when the global temperature, riding the peak of the spike on top of that record-high floor, would make its run at yet another all-time record, the way 1998 and 2016 and 2024 all did at their peaks. Then into 2027 and even 2028, you get the long tail, the part people forget about. The agricultural and economic consequences of a peak winter El Niño do not land in real time. They land at harvest, months later. A monsoon that underperforms in the summer of 2027 shows up as a food supply problem and a price signal later that year and into the next. A drought that hammers southern Africa's growing season echoes through food security for a year afterward. And here is a detail worth knowing, because it is part of the natural rhythm. Strong El Niño events very often flip, afterward, into a La Niña, the cold phase, swinging the whole seesaw hard the other way. So the story may not simply end with the El Niño fading. It may hand off to its opposite, which brings its own pattern of droughts and floods just rearranged. The system does not return to neutral and rest. It tends to overshoot the other way. So the honest forward arc is not a single bad year. It is a multi-year reorganization of the planet's weather, peaking around the coming winter and rippling outward through 2027 and beyond. Now, what do you actually do with all of this? Because I do not believe in handing you a pile of dread and walking away. The answer is the same word I keep coming back to, and it is the opposite of panic. It is preparation. On the larger scale, this is exactly why those monitoring buoys exist, why forecasters watch the index, why relief organizations pre-position supplies when a strong El Niño is forecast, and why food markets and water managers plan ahead. The entire reason a strong El Niño today is survivable, in a way the 1877 event was not, is that we can see it coming and act. The warning is the gift. And on a personal scale, it is simply about awareness. If you live in the southern tier of North America, the coming wet season is worth taking seriously, and flood preparation is not paranoia, it is prudence. If you live where water comes from snowpack, a lean winter is worth planning around. If you live in a fire-prone part of the world on the dry side of this seesaw, the coming season deserves respect. None of this is about fear. It is about not being the person who gets caught off guard by something the whole planet could see coming months in advance. So we arrive back, finally, at the signal we started with, and at the question that has been hanging over this entire video. The index sits at plus 0.48, 1/100th of a degree below the official line, climbing season after season in the same relentless direction, with the models hinting at a monster and the odds of formation running as high as 90%. Everything we have walked through, the machine, the famine, the reefs, the floods, the fires, the record heat, the hotter floor underneath it all, has been in service of answering what comes next, and the answer is not a single tidy prediction, because the honest answer never is. The answer is that a force is loading in real time in a patch of ocean nobody sees that has the demonstrated power to reshape the next 3 years of weather across the entire planet, and we are watching it happen at the one moment when we can see that it is coming, but cannot yet see exactly how hard it will hit. If you want one simple set of things to actually watch over the coming months, here is the honest, jargon-free version. So this does not stay abstract. Watch that index. If it climbs past plus 1.5, you are looking at a strong event, and if it pushes toward plus 2.0, the Godzilla conversation becomes real rather than speculative. Watch the Western Pacific Rim, Australia and Indonesia, heading into their dry season, because that is where the first big impacts tend to show up, in drought and fire danger. Watch the Eastern Pacific for an unusually active hurricane season. And as the year turns toward winter, watch the southern United States and California for the storm parade, and watch the global temperature make its run at another record. None of these are predictions set in stone. They are the dials on the machine, and now that you understand how the machine works, you can read them yourself as the next year unfolds, instead of waiting to be told after the fact what already happened. That, more than any single forecast, is what I hope you take from all of this, the ability to watch it with open eyes. Part 15. How we learned to see it coming. I have spent this whole video telling you what El Niño does, but I have skipped over a question that is, in its own way, just as remarkable. How do we know any of this? How can I tell you, with a straight face, that an event in 1877 was one of the strongest in history when nobody back then had a satellite or a buoy, or even a clear idea that the Pacific Ocean was driving their suffering? And how can forecasters today say, months in advance, that a monster is probably loading? The answer is a story about humanity slowly learning to read a language the planet had been speaking all along, and it is the reason the next 3 years will not catch us the way the past once did. For most of human history, El Niño was invisible. People felt its effects, the failed rains, the vanished fish, the floods, but they experienced them as isolated local disasters, acts of fate with no common cause. The connection between a warm patch of Pacific water and a famine in India was simply unimaginable, because no one could see the whole board at once. It took until the 20th century for scientists to even realize that these scattered events were linked, that a seesaw of atmospheric pressure across the Pacific, which they called the Southern Oscillation, was tied to the ocean warming that the South Americans had named El Niño. Putting those two halves together, the ocean half and the atmosphere half, into the single coupled system we now call ENSO, was one of the great detective stories of climate science. And the machine I described to you earlier, the Bjerknes feedback, was named for the scientist who finally explained how the two halves drove each other. But understanding the machine in principle is not the same as watching it in real time, and that capability was bought with a disaster. It was the 1982 event, the monster that built up almost completely undetected and blindsided the world, that finally forced the issue. In the aftermath, scientists and several nations built something genuinely heroic. They strung a line of moored buoys straight across the equatorial Pacific, an array of instruments sitting out in the open ocean, continuously measuring the temperature of the water at the surface and far below it, the winds, the currents, and feeding all of it back to forecasters in real time. For the first time in history, humanity had its hand on the pulse of the system that had been secretly steering the planet's weather for millennia. When you hear me say the index is at plus 0.48 and climbing, that number exists because of those buoys and the satellites that now watch the ocean from above. We are not guessing anymore. We are reading the machine directly as it loads. And we can do something even more astonishing. We can read the events that happened before any instrument existed, because the ocean keeps its own records. Coral, as it grows, lays down annual bands a little like the rings of a tree, and the chemistry of those bands records the temperature and rainfall of the water around them, year by year, going back centuries. Ice cores, sediment layers on the seafloor, and the rings of ancient trees all carry their own faint signatures of past El Niño events. By reading these natural archives, scientists have been able to reconstruct the history of ENSO going back not just centuries but thousands of years, which is how we know that the 1877 event was the extreme it was, and how we know that super events have punctuated human history again and again, long before we had any idea what was hitting us. The planet, it turns out, has been keeping a diary the whole time. We only recently learned to read it. This is why I keep insisting that the warning is the gift, and why preparation, not panic, is the only sane response. Every previous generation that lived through a super El Niño did so blind. They could not see it coming, could not name it, could not prepare for it, and in the worst cases, untold numbers of them died because of that blindness. We are the first generation in the entire history of our species that can watch one of these load in advance and act before it peaks. That is not a small thing. That is the difference between 50 million deaths and a hard but survivable year. So the unease the scientists feel watching this signal is real, but it sits right alongside something they would never trade away, which is sight. We can finally see the thing that used to kill in the dark. The only question that remains is whether seeing it is enough, and what it means to live on a planet where the most powerful forces shaping our future are ones we can now watch, in real time, but still cannot stop. Part 16, The Patch of Water That Decides. So let me bring us all the way back to where we started, to that stretch of ocean along the equator that almost none of us will ever see, and let me leave you with the thought that has been sitting underneath this entire video. There is something genuinely humbling, almost vertiginous, about the fact that the temperature of a patch of water out in the middle of the Pacific, water with no coastline and no name, can reach across the entire planet and decide whether a harvest succeeds in India, whether a reef lives or dies off Australia, whether California floods, whether a family in southern Africa has enough to eat. We like to imagine that we are the main characters, that human affairs are driven by human decisions. And then the trade winds slacken over an ocean most people never think about, and the whole world quietly bends. The index reads plus 0.48 tonight. By the strict definition, it has not even officially begun. And yet everything we have walked through, the machine, the feedback loop, the famine that killed tens of millions, the reefs that turned white and died, the floods and the fires on opposite sides of the same ocean, the record heat stacking higher on a floor that has never been higher, all of it is hanging on the direction that one number has been moving season after season in the dark for the past 6 months. The strongest El Niño in recorded history may have already begun. We are standing at the one moment when we can see the shape of it forming, but cannot yet see how large it will grow, and by the time we know for certain, the answer will already be the weather outside our windows. Here is the part I find both unsettling and, in a strange way, hopeful, and it is the note I want to leave you on. For the entire span of human history before us, this force operated in total secrecy. It moved nations, ended dynasties, and emptied villages, and the people it destroyed never even knew its name. We are the first ones who get to watch. We get to see the dice being loaded, to count how heavily, to warn each other, to prepare, to move food and brace coastlines and protect the most vulnerable, all before the peak arrives. That power to see is the single greatest advantage our generation holds over every generation that came before us, and it is the entire reason that what comes next does not have to rhyme with 1877. The ocean is going to do what the ocean does. It always has. The only thing that has ever been up to us is what we do with the warning, and the warning right now is loading in a patch of water nobody sees, asking the only question that has ever really mattered when the Pacific begins to turn. Not whether it is coming, but whether this time we are finally ready to listen.